Our exhibitions seek to illustrate how poetry lives in the world and to honor the people who create it. We love Broadsides and for a long time have wanted to highlight the iconic Chicago Poetry Center Broadsides series.
I think in this show with the Chicago Poetry Center, we can really see this exciting example of many ways that poetry can look, because we can look at the broadsides, and so looking at the actual shape of the poems on the page, and also the historical material of how this organization has manifested poetry in the lives of Chicagoans for the last half century.
Chicago Poetry Center story, it's such a Chicago story.
When I got there in 2000, I became very curious, profoundly curious about where did this organization come from? Why is it here? What is its genesis? What are its roots? What is its DNA? I was pleasantly surprised to find all this really cool literary history right under our noses. Everything that the Poetry Center became comes out of that era. So Irving Rosenthal is the editor of the Chicago Review. He's got this guy named Paul Carroll still hanging around years after graduating, and he has these connections with people in the West Coast. So they get in trouble with the powers that be at the University of Chicago, and they say, well, we're not going to let you publish that because of its connection to the obscene beat poets. They create their own literary magazine called Big Table.
So Big Table was named by Jack Kerouac, and my father thought it was such a great evocative name because it invites everyone to it.
They print 10,000 copies, and a few hundred are held up in the post office. They're not mailed, and they are marked as obscene, and it basically goes to federal court. The thing that Paul did in Chicago was he was the lightning rod for the beat movement in this city. And he was the anti-hero, dark hero of the beat movement, but he was also fondly remembered, and people appreciated what he did for the art form during that time.
He was a professor and a teacher because he loved literature and he loved poetry. And he loved sharing it and teaching it with people that also loved it. All of my young life, he would mention names: Maxine Chernoff, Rose Simon, Elaine Equi, Paul Hoover, Peter Kostakis, Peter Schechter, Lisel Mueller. So those were people that were part of his life in 1974, 75, etc.
In some ways, my mother's an outsider in one way. Paul Carroll's an outsider in another way. I mean, my mother is a wonderful poet, but she's also an accessible poet in a way that frankly doesn't invite a lot of academic interest, and then throw in the fact that she herself had no academic affiliations. So her first book is then published in 1965, and then the second comes out in 75, so that's just after she joins the Poetry Center, which starts in 74.
The photograph by Norris McNamara of all of them, that's the up angle or down angle shot in black and white. He was a really elegant photographer that was friends with my father. The visuals of it I remember, and my dad was in charge of that because he knew that Norris was a great photographer, and he wanted it to look good, and it did look good.
Poetry at the time was a caged beast. It maybe happened at a university for a small group of people studying, or it would happen in somebody's salon in their personal residence. But doing public poetry readings, that was an innovation in this city that the Poetry Center helped pioneer.
I remember, most of what I remember was when it was in the old MCA. I remember too that as part of her duties as a board member, that sometimes we would be hosting visiting poets out at the house. And so Margaret Atwood was out at the house. The other person I remember was Charles Simic, whose work my mother also loved. One story my mother had about a poetry center reading, I was not there, but it was Ginsberg reading. And I remember her mentioning that there was a line and that people were in the line were like passing around a bottle of wine and singing Guantanamera. And that, to get to your question about community, you know, that's not happening out in semi-rural Illinois, right? And so I think that is part of, you know, that's part of what Chicago itself, but also, you know, a connection with the Poetry Center means to her.
The thing that I did early on is connect to that early Poetry Center history. I started reading the archives. I started reading the stuff that was in my office at the time, just in drawers and in file cabinets. All this stuff, like the first press release of the Poetry Center from 1974, which gives its modus operandi of what the organization's gonna do and how it's gonna do it and why it's gonna do it. It's got 3 guiding principles. Encourage the public to be interested in poetry. Stimulate and encourage poets to write poetry. Find professional opportunities for poets. Every single one of those things is ridiculously hard to do. But it's just such a laser beam into what you need to do.
That's one of the reasons I joined, because it was an organization that I can't say just understood poetry and poets, but was trying to help and encourage the reading of poetry and the way poetry was understood and discussed, etc.
When I came into the Poetry Center, there were some bespoke broadsides. And I was like, well, we should be doing these for each of our readings. So one of my favorite collabs that I did between a poet and an artist was a broadside that I created for Lawrence Ferlinghetti's reading at the Poetry Center. And it was a homecoming for Ferlinghetti because Ferlinghetti always stayed on very positive terms with Paul. I called Ed up and I said, Ed, hey, do you want to do Ferlinghetti's broadside? And he was like, yeah, sure. So why did Ed Paschke send me a chicken? We would literally get calls for the Poultry Center. The Poultry Center, and they want live chicken. And I just loved it. It was great. And we would, and whenever it happened, it was like a big deal. It was like, woohoo! Poultry Center call, alert, alert. So we ended up with like poultry around the office, like Pier 1 chickens, or, and then I started like secretly putting chickens on, brochures and business cards as just like kind of a little icon of the place, just to have a little bit of fun.
I'll never forget meeting with Kenneth to sort of learn what he does or how he does it, and we sat together at the Monadnock building right by Millennium Park. It wasn't Millennium Park at that time, and he just sat me down and told me the work that he was doing, particularly the broadsides. Right, so the broadside, this illuminated poem, right, a poem on a piece of paper, but then mixed with art, which is not always the case, but I remember being so taken by how hands-on he was and the way that he worked with artists, like directly on the page.
All poems are looking for readers, right? Like the act of writing a poem is always like going out to the reader. And so I think the work that, we all do if we work with poetry is to sort of help that endeavor. And so Chicago Poetry Center has really been doing that for such a long time now.
The other part of it that I did, though, which was as important, if not more important, was pay back a debt that I had to a 4th grade teacher who brought a poet into my classroom to teach us how to read a poem and then be inspired by a poem and write a poem.
So this is my folder from 5th grade, actually. I still have it with me. It says right here, hands-on. Of course, it's a Bratz folder because, I was a 10-year-old. So the poem is called Chicago. I'm just laughing at the Carl Sandburg reference. I have a lot of grammatical errors here. So I'm just gonna read it as, I'll switch around words to make it more understandable. Chicago is a very busy city. I like it, but it is windy. There's a lot of buildings and parks. It is great. Also, the beach is hot in the summer. Chicago is a great place to live because there are a lot of jobs. There are factories, schools, buildings, once again, and lots of stuff. But all that I hate in Chicago is the unfair laws. I do remember my teacher telling us, we're gonna have our poet in residence coming over tomorrow or the day after, and I remember just being so excited and looking forward to that day because I was able to read and write poetry, so that was very meaningful for me. CPC gives students an opportunity to explore their world within poetry, within literature, at a time when they're not able to fully go out and explore the world. I'm first generation American. My parents were undocumented at that time, and I remember I was becoming more aware of politics, and that was during 2005, 2006. That was when they had the immigration reform marches. I do remember writing poems about the unfair laws, at that time, and I guess just exploring what it meant to be Mexican American at that time. I think if it weren't for that poetry residency, I would probably not be working here at the Poetry Foundation today. Definitely, I would not be if I had not been exposed to poetry at that very young age of 8 and 10 years old.
I remember one day, my sister, who wanted to be Diana Ross and Maya Angelou, she had this poem by Gwendolyn Brooks called We Real Cool. And I remember just reading that poem over and over again. And I would say that poem around the crib and stuff. And I wouldn't stutter and stuff, you know what I mean? I encountered the Poetry Center in the early aughts.
I know that I was casting about looking for people who would be poets in residence, who would be willing to do that. As far as the Gwendolyn Brooks Hands on Stanzas Award, after Gwendolyn died, I sent an email over to Nora Brooks Blakely saying I was looking for a way to honor Gwendolyn. And would she be okay with us using her name to give to a teaching poet in the school, a poet in residence? And she was cool with that. And so I think that Marvin and then Cecilia Pinto, that was maybe the second year we gave that award out.
And I was sitting in the room and they were announcing the names. I was like, oh man, so-and-so won. And then they mentioned my name and I just couldn't believe it, I was like, hey man, you can do this. This is your world, Art made me, that was my world, man, I could be whatever. I could be whatever.
There was a time where I wasn't even sure if the Poetry Center was going to survive.
Over the course of maybe 3 or 4 years, the budget became really just about zero. So that was the difficult time. Things got so bad that at some point, a couple of the board members said, well, we really should just look at dissolving the Poetry Center of Chicago because the money's not coming in. We're not doing the readings, which were the big thing that the Poetry Center was doing before that. It was a long discussion about what the history of the Poetry Center was, the poets who had been involved in building the Poetry Center from the start, the long history of the big name poets that came into Chicago when there was not a lot of poetry going on in Chicago. And so I forget how many of us were left at that meeting, 4 or 5 of us, and 3 of us voted not to dissolve.
My dad holds near and dear to his heart, protecting organizations that do different art work things. And so he could see the magic of this space and, wanted it to be held onto. And I had the perspective as a young person starting out in my career, just coming from launching a magazine and doing the work I was doing with Occupy to say, sure, I can try to start this too. And I think he and I both have a bit of a, sort of can-do attitude with a maybe unhealthy dose of optimism around these things that allowed us both to say, yeah, let's try to do this. So when I come in, if you can imagine it, the organization is at a point where it basically has something like negative $2,000 and a commitment to paying a contractor for 4 hours a week to see if they can do something. So this is like real shot in the dark territory where truly none of us had any idea if this was going to work or not. I do think that there is a little bit of space for change and innovation when there's nothing else in the room. And so that made space for a lot of reinvention. And I really envisioned that reinvention happening in the legacy of everything that the Poetry Center had stood for historically. So, you know, from this very early idea of a bigger table, making sure that there's room for a broad diversity of contemporary voices in poetry, that everybody gets to be in the room, that there's not one right way to experience poetry or engage with poetry. That was there from the beginning, and that was something that we could continue and reinvent for a new era. And so what we could do in this reinvention was rebuild a reading series on that legacy and rebuild an education program on that legacy. So in the roving reading series phase, curatorship transitioned from Danielle Suzy to Natasha Miharis. I think my all-time favorite event, and it is really hard to choose because there have been so many over the years, is our once annual, hopefully to return someday, Poetry on a Boat. Tara was reading, her water goddess poetry, and Avery was bringing the house down and singing to everybody on the boat. And then we move into Marty McConnell's era.
What I appreciate too about the addition of Marty McConnell is Marty knows everybody. And people say, Andre, you know everybody. I was like, no, I know Marty McConnell, and Marty McConnell knows everybody.
Go around and I should welcome you first. Hi, welcome. We've been chatting, so I forgot to say welcome. This is an organization that fundamentally believes that poetry is for everyone, and that the best thing we can do for poetry is to break down the barriers between people and poetry. The reading series has really developed in this organic way that said, okay, well, we need opportunities for people to come together and discuss poems and do some writing in a shared space. And so we incorporated the writing workshop with it. And then we said, okay, so there's the workshop and then there's the performance, but there's a little gap. People don't have a chance to hear each other, right? So we incorporated the brief open mic. And we've really seen over even the last couple years, so much community form around the reading series.
Moving on, so we have our open mic. We're going to hear from 5 people. Each of those people is going to read one poem or 3 minutes, whichever comes first. If you have a Viking epic, just read 3 minutes of it.
I think part of what is beautiful about the Poetry Center is how creative and collaborative and generative everyone is. And so many different people have worked on so many different things together. I started generating the idea for Critical Conversations and then passed it off to Greg Geoffroy and Marty McConnell to build from there, and then they built something truly amazing.
The program really grew out of this understanding that there was this real need for facilitated conversations, particularly in workplaces, around sticky issues like race, like gender and sexuality. But so often those conversations, even when they're facilitated, require the people who've been most directly and violently affected by these issues to tell their stories, right? And so we were talking at the Poetry Center about how problematic that is for that kind of labor to fall on the folks who've been most affected. And so the answer rose up of, well, what about the places where those stories have already been told, i.e. poems? My big dream for CPC is that we have the resources to create the platforms, to create the audiences, to create the community so that people can access poetry wherever they want to, whenever they want to.
So within our education programs specifically, they've changed and grown so much over my time with the organization, and I'm so proud of what's happening with them now, and Helene as the leader of those programs and all of our amazing poets and residents in them. And getting there has been quite a journey.
I started somewhere, and where I started writing was a Chicago public school classroom. And I think having our poets in residence as teaching artists in CPS gives students the opportunity to do something that they might have never tried before. I think what I've really valued about the poets in residence, and we've had many cohorts since I've been a part of the Chicago Poetry Center, but what I really value about them is that they come from so many different backgrounds. They write in so many different styles. What they experience as poets in residence kind of mirrors my experience with the Chicago Poetry Center, and that is really finding a community of poets. So what I hope for CPC is that we continue to build out our programming so that we can really reach, if we're dreaming big, every student in Chicago Public Schools.
I would love the idea of there being a poet in every classroom. What naturally sits alongside that is more and more jobs for poets and better paying jobs for poets. We still want to expand our pay equity work towards our teaching artists. It's nowhere near done, but we're really proud of the work we've done so far, and we feel like it puts us in a great position to keep innovating and keep building on that work.
We're continuing to do our best to meet the needs of the different students in the district. So we've been developing, performance-focused curriculum, as well as Spanish language curriculum. And I think as we continue to move forward, it would be a goal of mine to create fully accessible curriculum for students with special needs and students living with disabilities.
I think it's important for children and all of us to feel like our cares, our questions, the things we're curious about, the things that we're heard about are important. I am a poet and teaching artist with the Chicago Poetry Center. I'm also one of the producers and the star of CPC's video education series that's called Queensy's Poetic Adventures. I am Queen Z, royal protector of the human soul. Ironically, Queen Z sort of came out of the pandemic, because I have to admit, when we were at home making our own videos and we couldn't see our students, right? So we're making these, but the thing is, you already have a bond with the class from the previous months. It's been good these years that I have been working with Chicago Poetry Center. And also, I know this may sound crazy, but I think there was a point for myself, being of a certain age, there was some part of me that was kind of like, do I have anything to offer young people, to 21st century young people? Can I connect
And the answer is, yes, I do, you know? And that's been very, that's been personally satisfying. And it also still gives me something to aspire to. Mm-hmm. But the students said, "Thank you for teaching us poetry. It let out my inner beast. It encouraged me to be me because it reminded me of magic. Love, Sonia."
I've always loved education, poetry, and performance. And so with this job, I was able to combine all my loves, put them in one bucket. And I also am someone who can't sit still. So it was lovely for me to travel the city and really be able to see the whole city. Places where I live, places where I don't live. And bring, I always say, the good news of poetry to people. You know, Ruth Stone, the poet, says, you know, the poems are floating and then we have to catch them before they go through our body. And if they do go through our body, then we have to run after them. And I love that. I had students fly paper airplanes on the very last day in honor of Ruth Stone, saying that. So this is a poem called High Rising by Connor S. And it was, the prompt that I created was talk about something that happened at school, but make it a school memory. And so I wanted to make sure that they were sort of including a little bit of nostalgia. Even if the memory happened an hour ago, you know, or the event happened an hour ago, it's still a memory. And so this is, I often return to this poem because I think it's such a metaphor for life and creating a creative life. And it's called High Rising by Connor S. When we made our dream houses, people were talking about, as some were wandering around the class, others began to stress out. Inches, feet, stairs, and more, until we all finished our floors. I think that's gorgeous. Sorry, I just love it so much. It's just perfect. It's perfect.
When I was in middle school, like about 6th grade, and I was just going through a lot of stuff at that time, like bullying. I was at a new school, I was going into middle school. It was just trying to navigate that and just writing down like my thoughts. I didn't even know I was writing poetry. I just was writing, like, in my mind, lyrics to songs. And it wasn't until a teacher that was seeing what I wrote. She's like, "Oh, you're writing a nice poem." I'm like, "Oh, okay." And just realizing that you can make a career out of it was also exciting to me because I didn't think that was possible. But just like getting into poetry and just writing in general kind of like made that seem like, oh, I could do this for a living. So I have been involved with CPC for the past 5 years as a poet in resident and also a poet in resident board member. And I feel that the Chicago Poetry Center kind of brings poetry, like, you know, people can be poets. It doesn't matter who you are, you can be a poet. And as long as you have a story to tell, you can bring that out and we'll help you bring that out. From one of my students, Haley, Joy, if you're reading this, you are nice and I will miss you and you bring me joy. And I was like, I was trying not to tear up when I read this when she gave it to me. I was like, oh, thank you. And my students know I like dogs because my dog had recently passed away. So I was like, oh, I didn't even know they were gonna do this. They were just drawing. I was like, what do you do with the colored pencil? They said, you'll see. And then at the end, they just gave it to me. And I was like, you guys are gonna make me like cry and I need tissue. And they were just like, these were like really sweet 4th graders who gave me all this. And I really appreciate it.
My other favorite all-time thing is our all schools reading, which is when we have a student from every classroom that we're in come read at a central event space. For many of our students, it's the first time that they're performing live. It's the first time that they're sharing their art with the world in such a public way. And we often see students really transform in this experience into the sort of welcoming and celebration of their work into the world. And at the same time, I often see the adults transform. The access point that we're making for young people into poetry then translates back and kind of rebounds to the adults and creates this beautiful loop of creativity and energy. Having fun. I actually think this is the most important one. Have a really good time up here. We are so excited to hear your poem. We're so excited to celebrate all the work you've been doing. So just have a great time.
A dark tunnel, a maze, even a puzzle. I'm not in an apartment where I usually sleep. I sink into the dream more deep and deep.
Sly syncopation penetrates the prairie, as if it were the devil's lullaby.
My sweater feels like soft clouds, soft like a blanket, light as a feather.
The wind warm and nice, the taste I just can't resist, the toppings are just amazing.
Sometimes you might feel like drowning, but friends and family can pull you out of the abyss.
Happiness is like a never-ending recess. Recess is like an open field. I worry the world will become just war. I cry because Johnny's moved to Puerto Rico. I am Mexican and proud.
But all in all, it's just another story. Within each of these poems, a true lesson appears. A writer's mind is set free, just like on this one, on what a poem is to me.
Oh, I'm sure he'd be glad, and he would want them to keep promoting new writing. I think he would also love to hear and meet the new writers that are involved in it, if they're young people or students. I think he always loved that because it's fresh, and then sharing with them things that they might like.
I think she'd be delighted. I think she would also just reflect on the enormous changes in poetry itself over those 50 years. You know, there's, and the fact that the Poetry Center has endured through that. She would, I mean, she would remember her part in that as well.
I think that what Beth is doing now in creating a fundamental structure around the organization on how it works and getting that practiced over a long time. I mean, she's the longest serving executive director in the organization's history.
When I think about CPC's future, what I want to make sure is that however it grows and evolves beyond my time, that the thing that is really held on to is this legacy of inclusion, of building a bigger table, and trusting that whoever comes next into this work will have their own new and great innovative ideas for how you do that at that time. This organization has always been highly responsive to the moment that it's in, and I trust that whoever is in this next is going to be responding to the unique challenges of their time and using poetry as a vehicle to create greater liberatory practices and inclusion in our community.